Although I'd like to think basic human decency would keep us from intentionally harming our research participants, there can be more gray areas than we realize. In this section, we'll learn about the process that helps us make sure we've thought about potential ethical concerns, the IRB review. As you've read about, many institutions have institutional review boards that review research. There are obviously common principles applied by IRB members, but each institution has different forms and processes, so we need to be familiar with those for Northwest. The easiest way to find that information is to search the Northwest webpage for IRB and then select the Institutional Review Board option in the results list. I'll also place a direct link in our course materials. We'll start with the information in the What to Submit section. The sections above that address many issues we've learned about earlier. At the top of the What to Submit page, we learn one very important piece of information. There are 3 categories for review. This is important because the different categories require different forms and go through different processes, so we can cost ourselves time by selecting the wrong forms. That said, note that the exempt category does not mean that we can skip the IRB process altogether. It means it is exempt from review by the whole committee. We may not have to wait for them to meet, and so forth. So, how do we determine whether we can go through the speedy exempt review? The type of review depends on 2 criteria: risk level and vulnerability of participants. In other words, they concern beneficence and respect for persons. This page includes examples of vulnerable populations and examples of the type of risk of concern to the IRB committee. The vulnerable populations are the same as those we discussed in learning about the Belmont principles. Risks are operationalized in terms of the degree to which they may be encountered in day-to-day life. If they're on par with that, it's minimal risk. Greater than that is greater than minimal, and no known risk is minimal risk. The chart at the bottom of the page indicates which type of review is most likely appropriate given the risk level and vulnerability of participants. So research involving less than minimal risk with non-vulnerable participants would most likely require an exempt review, while any project working with vulnerable participants may require full review. So, from the notes on the IRB webpage, which level of review do you think we will be required for our project? Exempt, expedited, or full? Our project would fit the criteria for exempt review. As a class project, which will only be used for learning rather than presentation or publication, it's actually not required to go through the IRB process, but we'll practice working with the forms. The section of the IRB page labeled Review Categories and Forms includes instructions for each type of review. If you've not already done so, please pause this presentation and go to this page, then download the instructions for exempt research and the exempt research form. In many cases, the projects you'll do as a student, including projects for this class, will qualify for exempt review. I think the first portion of the first page is relatively straightforward. You would provide your personal contact information. In the area asking for a university department, with the first arrow, you'd put the department with the class doing the project or where your research advisor teaches. For class, you'd list your teacher as the advisor. For the project title, the second arrow, you'll use a title similar to what you'll use for your project as a whole. We'll talk about that shortly. Similarly, you'll include the abstract from your proposal for the summary of the project, the section with the third arrow. Entering the summary of the project will obviously move the following information down the page. As it's initially formatted, though, the information at the bottom of this page continues at the top of the second page. The important thing is that we indicate why the research would be exempt. You may need to refer to the first and second page of the instructions for exempt review to decide which category applies. Then, when you click where it says Choose an Item to the right of the word Category, it will activate a drop-down menu listing the 6 categories of exempt review. Note that many self-report projects will fall under Category 2, which includes survey and interview procedures. Something about the formatting of the questions under exemption criteria throws me off. I seem to overlook them if I'm not careful. And note that there are 6 questions in that section. As you read the content of each question, you might think about which of the Belmont principles and APA guidelines it addresses. Remember, that's really the point of this process, making sure we're considering each of those principles and related guidelines. The original formatting of the document splits the next segment of the form across the second and third pages. Note that the place you need to provide information about human participant involvement may not be in the same page as the instructions. Your response in that area should summarize the information you would include in the procedure section of a proposal or manuscript, so that the reader can confirm that participants will not be at risk. Questions 2 and 3 on the second page of the exempt review forms ask whether participants are made aware of voluntariness and confidentiality issues. Although it isn't worded that way, this is really asking about informed consent. Similarly, the wording of the questions almost gives the impression we only need to submit documentation if we're delivering the information verbally. But in my experience, the committee wants to see a copy of the informed consent statement, no matter how it is delivered. That said, there are a number of resources available to help when we need to write an informed consent statement, including samples in the additional resources section of the Northwest IRB website. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office for Human Research Protections, OHRP, website provides an interesting context in explaining expectations for informed consent. That website encourages researchers to think of informed consent as a process which demonstrates respect for persons and educates potential participants about research. In other words, informed consent should not just be a form that needs to be filled out. One implication, then, is that the informed consent also needs to be written in terms our participants will understand, not jargon or legalese. The Northwest IRB website includes instructions for submitting forms, but make sure to check with your instructor or research advisor before sending forms to the committee. Class projects sometimes go through different processes. For example, you'll submit the forms for our projects to me,